Okay. So as Kelly mentioned, I'm the founder of a design studio that's based in Toronto in Canada. And each year, what we do is donate our time and hire a team to work on a project in the social sector, a pro bono project. And in the summer of 2019, we worked with a number of different groups working on youth homelessness. And I think I was mentioning to you earlier, Kale, I think that as much as I think I have things to share here, I think we have things to learn. I think that it's a kind of a mixed bag of things that we've tried and things that I think kind of worked out well, applying service design to a kind of policy, a new federal policy that was coming into place in Canada around homelessness. And I think there's a number of things that we tried that didn't really work out so well that I'm kind of actually frustrated about. And, they say when you look back at your work from a few years before, you should be a little bit embarrassed, that you feel like you've gotten better and you would do things better. I kind of feel like there's things that we could have done better. So I'm hoping, I know there's a lot of very smart people on this call, and I'm hoping as much as I share that I can learn from all of you. So in the spirit of that, excuse me, my voice is still waking up here. Please feel free to ask questions. If there are suggestions you have, if at any time I'm speaking too quickly, please let me know as we go through this. I wanted to start by doing a land acknowledgement, and maybe people in the chat could put where you're coming in from, where you're joining us from today, because I'm curious as well, and maybe Kali, you could share with me. But I just want to acknowledge that where I'm calling you from today is actually the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat, and that we also recognize the ongoing presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. We do these land acknowledgements here in Canada as something, as a part of a reconciliation process that's going on actively around the historical treatment of First Nations people, and a lot of the kind of historical issues, as well as the ongoing systemic racial issues that continue to happen. And so this is actually relevant to the case that I'm going to be sharing today. I'm curious, where are people joining from? Are most people in Sweden, or you all over the place?
Then we have Oslo, Norway, Stockholm, Chris, Sweden, Tallinn, Estonia, Linköping in Sweden, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, I guess, and Sweden right now. So mostly Sweden, but also some other countries.
Okay, great. And someone's actually up early in Pittsburgh too, so thank you. Great. So this was a project that was with Bridgeable and then a number of different partners. This was with the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, was one of the partners, and then with Away Home Canada. And they had been given money to create a roadmap, and this is a collection of researchers and university scholars to look at how to permanently end homelessness here in Canada. And a key component of that approach was something, a law, a new law that was to look at actually creating a duty to assist and actually ensure that people had a right to housing. And so I don't know if anyone's familiar with this. So this is called duty to assist. I don't know if people have heard of this, but this is an innovative rights-based approach to homelessness prevention that's adapted from Wales. It's since we did this, been adopted as well in England and Scotland. And it's actually a legal duty requiring that local authorities make efforts to end a young person's homelessness. And more so than a law, it's actually a set of policies that are meant to retool the service sector. So in Wales, speaking to Pete Mackey, the guy who's kind of led the charge there, he said that what happened is essentially people in the service sector around homelessness went from being gatekeepers to being estate agents, being more like real estate agents trying to find people homes. So you can imagine in the past, and I'm not sure how it works in the countries you're calling in from, but there's only so many beds in a homelessness shelter. There's only so much money to give out to families. There's only so much food at the food bank. So essentially, people are gatekeepers, kind of deciding who gets things and who doesn't get things. But what happened is it actually changed to being now I have a legal obligation to find you a place to stay. And if you think about the mental models associated with homelessness, there's kind of roughly three main models. You can think about handing out charity, that these are people who kind of need charity. There's also a frame of, we need to reform misbehavior. These are people who are kind of fitting outside of the norms of society and we need to reform them. Or that you're actually enabling a legal right. That actually, if you live in our country, you have a right to housing, and our job as people in this sector is actually to ensure that you have that. Is anyone familiar with this? I'm just curious from a show of hands, because I know this probably made the rounds. Maybe put your hands up if you've seen this before. This comes from Peter Jackson, who's a designer who does work in the policy design space. And on the right-hand side, you can see this is kind of the relationship between policy, like what a government does and says, and what the citizen actually experiences. And if you see on the right-hand side, a government develops policies, these are written kind of, written laws and stipulations of how they plan to kind of conduct things. Those lead to a number of different processes. And then at the other end, on the left-hand side in red, you see the services. And the services are actually the things that citizens experience. And contrastedly, if you look at what the citizen experiences, they really don't have a lot of insight into what's happening at the policy level. Really, how things materialize is in the services that they experience. And I really like services. I think that they're neat for a lot of reasons, but I think that when it comes to policy design, I think this is an interesting way of thinking about really to see if your policy is effective, I think, is to see, are the services actually changing for the people? So our role as designers when we were working on this, so while duty to assist was being drafted, the law was still underway. We were brought in to help support the team by applying design methods to translate the policy. So we looked from the perspective of youth at what touch points in the services could be mobilized to offer youth support. So again, if you think about that model, you're making a law, how would you actually make that material? How would it show up in the services that are experienced by citizens? So where would duty to assist materialize? How would the sector reorient? And for a number of reasons, this led us to focus on schools, as every youth who experienced homelessness was in school at one point, and youth reported that schools were a stabilizing factor in their life. Even when things were going poorly at home, if they were experiencing, different kinds of problems, school was always a kind of area that could be a stabilizing factor. So the project challenge we put together is how might we use design to prototype components of duty to assist in situ. So in Hamilton, Ontario, which is close to here in Toronto, where I live now, it's actually where I grew up. Hamilton is an industrial town. It's actually similar to Pittsburgh, where the person's calling in. It's considered the Rust Belt, where this was the industrial area that was part of the automotive boom. Steel factories are there, and it's kind of been in decline since then. It's kind of retooling itself. It's also next to the largest First Nations reserve in Canada. So it's an area where there's a lot of First Nations who are represented within the system there. So the goals overall of our service design project, we had three of them. So first was the idea that taking the written policy recommendations of duty to assist and translating them into specific service interventions would provide the people delivering and managing those services with greater kind of understanding and clarity of, again, what needs to change from a citizen's point of view? How do the services need to change? and that would actually lead to higher rates of adoption, that actually the service sector itself, the people delivering services to people who are experiencing homelessness, that would change, that would transform. The second goal was that using a co-creative approach with a broad section of system stakeholders, so people like the service agencies, youth who'd experienced homelessness, indigenous communities, funders, school boards, that would actually help transform the system actors' mental models and actually get them to think differently about how they relate to one another. Actually bringing them together and simulating how this policy would be in the future would make them think about how they change, how their relationships to one another change, and they would actually find new ways to relate and transform their relationships. And third, that actually by simulating this, and again saying, okay, well, how does it look when it's actually happening, designing that, simulating it, we'd actually get really good insights into the logic of the policy while it's still being formed and written and delivered to the government. So we'd be able to kind of deliver a smarter written policy that would actually, in fact, be more kind of grounded in the reality of what it needs to do in the future. I'll say as well that we were really informed by this idea of, kind of service logic, really thinking about, service experiences being social processes that involve providers and clients, that I think that the traditional way of this kind of industrial model, this linear sequence of thinking about, developing a policy, coming up with different kinds of standards and then trying to implement it, following a kind of linear industrial model doesn't work really well. You have to kind of simulate it because a lot of the value is in use and you can't really understand that. And that we actually had to tangibilize, we had to make this service real to really understand the social codes and the systems of belief that are part of the service to make it work. That it's hard to do in abstract, that you have to actually kind of make it real. And this idea of, I love this word, I think that's made up, called tangibilize. That's from Fragnieri. But I think this will likely make sense to all of you as far as thinking about kind of service logic. Okay, so that's kind of background context. Now I want to talk more about how we actually simulated policy in practice. This is the process that we took when we underwent this project. We did a kind of understand phase, which used an arts-based research approach with young people with lived experience and, excuse me, and with professionals who work in the field. We then did a co-creative process with different kinds of interactive sessions, bringing in system actors from across the different sectors, again, having them think about kind of reforming resources, enacting how these new services would work. And then we prototyped and refined concepts through testing with young people and service providers. Underneath all of this, we had an anti-oppressive framework. And anti-oppressive framework is a framework and a method for understanding how systems of oppression, things like colonialism and racism, homophobia, transphobia, classism, result in discriminatory actions and structural and systemic inequalities for certain groups within society. And again, I mentioned earlier, there's people who are very much, well, first of all, classism is a big issue. And when I talked earlier about the kind of mental models around how do you actually relate to people who are experiencing homelessness, people who are from the LGBTQ community are very much overrepresented within homelessness. People from the First Nations communities are overrepresented within these systems. So we actually trained the entire team working on this and went through a kind of anti-oppressive training to kind of understand not only our own bias that we're bringing in to this, but how are the systems, the historical systems that are set up in place, structured to kind of recreate and maintain some of these systems. So into the design process, and I'm happy to answer any questions as we go. Any questions so far?
There's nothing in the chat, but I keep an eye on the chat, and if it comes something up, I can just throw them out.
Great. Okay. Thank you. So we developed storytelling kits as part of this process, and this was really some of my colleagues, Chad Story, other people who I worked with, really thought a lot about proper methods for actually engaging with vulnerable populations. And so part of what we did is develop these storytelling kits, which were actually arts-based storytelling kits. We gave them to people who were involved with youth in the community a week ahead of time. So there was a community group that was working with youth who had experienced homelessness. So they had a week, and they had at a kind of community drop-in center time to work on this, and they helped facilitate that process. And it worked out really well. This was one of those things I think that we weren't too sure about. And if you look here, this is some of the outputs of the process. And if you look closely, like if you look at the one down in the left-hand corner, the kind of details, you look at the one in the middle on the bottom, there's a lot of very specific things that people brought of their own experience, thinking about telling their own story, really kind of materializing their own kind of things that are important to them, using their own voice. And this was really helpful when we actually had the interviews. You think about, again, the dynamics with the vulnerable population, a lot of the dynamics. This allowed for the interviewers or the researchers, when they were engaging, to have the participants take the lead. They had something, kind of a basis to work from that they could share and talk about. They had time to think about it and think about how they articulated it. So this was a really powerful artifact to kind of guide that process. One thing that we learned is that home is more than four walls and a roof over your head, that it's a lifelong pursuit. And this was kind of an interesting finding, given that so much of the dialogue around homelessness is often around the kind of affordability. I think that for a lot of people, it was really about kind of a sense of belonging. And this became important as we develop the service, as you'll see going forward. Next, we had co-design sessions with system actors. This was a lot of different people from the social sectors, people from the school board, administrators, people from ministries. We brought in people who were doing really interesting things already within the school board, teachers and administrators who were, finding really interesting ways to get jobs for youth who are at risk, where they could also get credits at the same time, where they were kind of experimenting with different things within their school. And at each school, there was somebody kind of doing something interesting like this. So we had different sessions. You can see here another kind of co-design sessions working through. We had multiple of these working through kind of multiple levels of fidelity, and having the different system actors kind of think about how they would reform the resources in the future. There's a lot of different project outputs that came out of this. In the first phase, there's a lot of kind of research-based artifacts to make sense of a lot of the things. So you can see there was policy principle cards that were trying to kind of articulate the policy in more clarity, some different concept boards. There was a process map where we actually thought about how would this new kind of rights-based service fit into teachers and administrators' current role. So kind of mapping it into the existing service process. And then some summary documents that were kind of explaining what was going on. But then we developed this the service itself, which we called Plugged In. And this was a number of different elements. So I'll share this with you, and then I'll share kind of some of how it went.
We have a question here first, Chris. And that is, how old are the children and youths, and how did the families around the kids get involved?
The youth who were involved in our project were all kind of teenage and up. A lot of them were a little bit older, kind of late teenage, early 20s, youth who had experienced homelessness in their past. Those were the main participants that we had. Does that answer the question?
Yep, thank you.
Okay, so Plugged In was the name we gave to this kind of new service. We had a number of different elements, and I'll kind of show you how they work, and I'll share more details. But some of the kind of big, touch points of this experience. One was a youth-centered school awareness campaign. So we thought you really need to raise awareness within schools that kids have these rights. People don't know that. So how do you actually raise awareness around the rights that people have, and the kind of supports available? There's AI-driven support that's really just kind of like a chat bot that helps link people with the resources, both youth and teachers. So how do I actually find, if I'm a person experiencing homelessness, or if I'm a teacher and I notice that someone's experiencing homelessness, how can I actually find the right thing depending on what the situation is? There's a lot of things happening. There's, like dozens of social service agencies, but no one kind of has clarity into all of them and what they're all doing. Common ground. So this was a drop-in center. So having a physical space within the school and support staff. And so having a place where people went with different community support organizations from the service sector, as well as having a kind of local champion within the school who would be there and available to help support people. And then finally, there's just some kind of training for teachers on like, what is this thing and what it actually is your obligation? What am I actually need to do? What do I need to look out for if it happens? What do I need to do? There's just some practical kind of training on like how would that actually look? Okay, so when we bring this to life, typically we'll do, we kind of bring this to life as an artifact on an ongoing basis by creating video prototypes. I'm sure many of you will do this. I find that these are great because a lot of those things about, value and process, context, relationships can be articulated more clearly by showing it in these kinds of dynamic formats. In the case of this project, we didn't really have a lot of time. We spent a lot more time on research up front. So we made something that was more of a photo narrative with audio recordings, which again was a bit of an experiment in this case. You can see how it works for you. And what it does is it follows two scenarios. The first is the scenario of Catherine, who is a grade 9 teacher who's been at the same school for a while, talking about, what's the situations they might run into, how this kind of the different touch points of the service kind of interact with what they do. And next is Sarah, a student who is at risk of experiencing homelessness. And then how would it work from their point of view? So this will take a few minutes. I'll just kind of hit play on this. First, we'll watch the scenario of Catherine.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I teach grade 9 math. I've been with the same school board for about 10 years now. I love my job because I get to watch these kids become young adults. I remember being a teenager. It's tough. So I do what I can to help them out. My one student, Glenn, he's really been struggling. He rarely shows up for class anymore, and when he does, he fights with the other students. I've had to send him to the principal's office more than a few times. I'm trained to teach these kids, but when it comes to these kinds of situations, I just don't know how to talk to them.
Catherine's school is piloting a new service called Plugged In. It's all about helping kids like Glenn get the extra help they need and guiding teachers like Catherine so they know what steps to take when they spot the early signs that a student could become homeless. She takes part in online training to learn more about the program and Duty to Assist, a new law that protects young people's rights to housing. Unsure of what steps to take next, Catherine downloads an app that's part of Plugged In. It asks her a few questions about Glenn, like if he's been acting out or if he's been less social than normal. She finds out that he needs to be connected to an in-school support worker and is given a few conversation starters to make approaching him feel a bit less awkward. Her conversation with Glenn went better than expected. He was open to the idea of getting some extra help, so they set up an appointment with a community support worker together. Catherine feels like she's on top of it now and has a better sense of what to do when a student needs some extra help.
Okay, so you can see, I mean, I don't know how you feel about that. I don't love it. But you know, we tried something, and it was fast. So some of the elements that are featured there. So there's this real world training. So this is online training that walks through real world scenarios. This guides staff on how to support students with Duty to Assist. And then again, there's this idea that there'd be leads, Duty to Assist leads that serve as champions and community liaisons. And this was a role that was, again, informally being played by teachers in the schools, where they would, again, be able to connect students with, you know, jobs or temporary housing or things like that, but actually having a formalized kind of role around that. Next is this recommendation engine for staff. Again, we just found that people had a real need around actionable steps. So this is a chatbot that just kind of goes through pathways to connect students to community resources. So it's just listing the things that are available and kind of helping them get connection to it. And then, you know, elements like no student information is collected, privacy is ensured are things that we kind of built in and kind of learned, I think, through the design process. I think a lot of these things we kind of iteratively learned as we built and tested things with people. And then conversation starters was an interesting one that came up again from teachers, that they felt that they had perhaps in the past known about potentially youth who were at risk, but felt really uncomfortable about approaching them and really wanted support in being able to have those kinds of conversations. So this was kind of like, again, just a way to help cover a kind of wide range of youth relevant topics and have a way to kind of open up that conversation. Okay, so now we're going to look at the same kind of what are the different touch points that would be experienced from the point of view of the students, and I'll talk a bit more about those at the end.
Hey, I'm Sarah. I just started grade 10 and I don't really know anyone at my new school. It feels like everyone's judging me. Sometimes my blood just starts boiling and I can really lash out. I usually get kicked out of class when that happens. I actually want to do well at school, but it's tough when everyone thinks you've got issues. I guess it doesn't help that I've been skipping class, but I don't think anyone's even noticed. Same thing at home. They've got their own stuff going on. There's no one at school I can reach out to because they just can't relate.
Things are getting worse for Sarah at home. She needs advice, like who she can talk to when things blow up at home or where to go when she needs to get out. Maybe this app can help. Sarah finds the advice she's looking for in the app, like what to do when there's a fight at home and counseling support to understand how to fit in. She wonders if it's time to talk to someone at school, maybe Mr. Cairns, He seems nice. Sarah worked up the nerve to talk to Mr. Cairns after class. It was a bit weird at first, but once they started talking, it wasn't so bad. He even offered to walk her over to the school drop-in center to meet with a support worker. It's a different kind of feeling for Sarah, but she really feels like Mr. Cairns has her back.
Again, I said at the beginning, you look back at your work and sometimes you feel like there's things you could do better. Okay, but some of the elements that were highlighted there, youth-centered school awareness. An interesting thing that came up here as we were prototyping this was really looking at the idea of a strengths-based approach. So you could imagine framing this as saying, are you experiencing problems? Is there violence at home? Is there, are you, in a precarious situation? But instead by saying the positive things, hey, there's advice, there's guidance, like you have a right to actually have supports. Framing it around a kind of strengths-based approach was really important. I'll talk a bit more about that afterwards. The idea as well, we thought, is that this could be co-created in schools or school boards. This could be, something that's done as, competition within school boards, or this could be art class or things where actually the youth are helping create this content. And at the same time, it's kind of raising awareness around some of these supports amongst students. Again, an advice generator, similar to what we talked about for students, that just kind of connects them with resources. And then the Common Ground Drop-In Center, again, a safe place with dedicated resources that's at the school. So that's some of what we prototyped and kind of thought about when we were going through this process. I want to talk about some of the policy implications. Again, one of the things we thought about as we were going through this policy was still being developed. And so it was by making this, building it with people, kind of enacting parts of it, testing it with different stakeholders. I think we learned a lot of really interesting things. So first was this idea that it was unclear where duty to report ends and duty to assist begins. So there's another law in legal obligation that teachers have, which is called duty to report, which is if they think that a student is being at risk of actually violence, then they must report it to the authorities. Going through this process, it became really clear people were like unclear about they're like, well, there's this duty to assist thing where we must give them kind of proper supports, but there's this other thing and they're kind of related, but they're not. So it's really important that we identified kind of expectations and differences between those two different responsibilities. Another was the concern that Indigenous young people may be singled out. Enforcement to duty to assist, as we work through with the different stakeholders, felt should really be developed with Indigenous communities to help foster self-determination amongst those communities. There's a terrible history in Canada of youth being taken away from their Indigenous youth being taken away from their families and re-educated within residential schools. There is a lot of systemic racism and cultural racism about Indigenous people that could actually lead, as we were doing this, prototyping it and thinking about like, how do you identify people, like ensuring that systemic racism doesn't play a role in who gets singled out. And again, this idea that the policy should be strengths-based rather than fear-based. And this was interesting working with First Nations stakeholders, that they actually felt that this was consistent with Indigenous ways of knowing that and being, that you should be focusing and positioning things around a strengths-based obligation, and again, not a kind of fear-based obligation. Okay, so when I talked earlier about some of these things that we were thinking about as we went through the process, so if you look at number 3, simulating a world in which duty to assist already exists would give direct insights into the logic of the policy. Yes, I would give us a green light on that. We actually got some good insights. We were able to make some recommendations that were actually included. Second, transforming, including a broad section of system actors would transform the system actors' mental models and how they relate to one another. I would give that kind of a yellow. I think that we've started to do more of that. When it comes to actually encouraging higher rates of things changing within the system, I would give us a red. Like, things aren't really changing as far as how the services are being delivered. Again, that we'd influence we ended up actually influencing the policy framing with an updated report that went to the federal government. So Away Home Canada and the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness continue to work really directly with the federal government. And when it was put into law, a lot of the recommendations of what I just shared with you, these policy recommendations, actually were included in what it went into the final policy. So I think that's great. You know, we actually were able to influence more nuanced thinking about some of the articulation of the written policy. Second, when it comes to taking a more co-creative approach, actually one of our team members joined the Away Home Canada. They've worked with them. The methods were really adopted by the organization of using more of these participatory kind of co-design methods. They continue to do really interesting work where youth at risk of homelessness are actually being trained to do the research and lead the research, and to lead some of the readouts of the research that's happening. So having a much more kind of youth-led process, a much more participatory process where their voice is much more represented and guided in how the research works. But again, I think that when it comes to taking the written policy and actually having it change the homelessness sector, there was funding for some elements of this originally, and it kind of petered out. And there's really been no long-term implementation or change within the service sector, which I find really kind of infuriating in a lot of ways, and frustrating. And so going back over this, you know, I had some kind of reflections.
Before Chris, we'll just have some kind of conversation in the chat, and I think we should take these questions maybe before you go on. And the first is prototyping policies. Is that a common way to develop new or existing policies in Canada? Or is what you have done a new way of using design?
Yeah, very different. Yeah, it doesn't really happen.
So this is not common in Canada to use this kind of policy prototyping? No. Okay, no. Perfect. And then we have this following up question, I think, building on the last question. How do you move from a situated experience or specific learning from prototypes and move towards policy recommendations?
Yeah. I think there's a kind of a translation that has to go in both directions. So I think when you're thinking about the policy and what it's meant to entail, I think you need to kind of, you know, go through a system of translation to say, okay, well, who are the right actors within the system? And then what are the different touch points within the system that would actually change? And I think this is, again, thinking about this is kind of how we thought about it. That how a policy translates to a citizen is in the services that they experience that are provided, then thinking about, well, what are the different touch points within a service experience that would be meaningful? How would those services change? How would maybe the system actors change? And I think that's a process that, and I'm happy to talk more about it. I think that, you know, I think there's an interesting thing generally, that when you take something like a policy, I think people think the general will apply to the specific. I can write something very broad and people will be able to apply it to a very specific scenario. I think myself as a designer, I think about it the opposite way. A specific thing will be able to apply to the general. That actually by simulating something very specific, I'm going to get very interesting insights into how I could generalize this back, which is kind of the things you saw, the things we learned about the policy implications. So it's about making it real on the ground. Again, when you think about services are experienced, it's the interaction between a provider and a user. If you bring it into that context, what do you learn about the policy? Does that make sense?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. And we have this last question in the chat for now, and that is, did the co-creation approach help you identify ways to trigger ongoing engagement awareness through continued co-creation?
100%, 100%. Yeah, and I think a really important part of this has been the ongoing relationship building that's happened. And I really think that the team member who I mentioned, who continues to be involved, some of the different actors within the system have continued to really champion this kind of approach. I've continued to be involved in certain ways as well. I think that it's really opened up a different way of doing things. Although I don't want to overstate how broadly accepted it has been. Like I think it's kind of opened things up and it's happening, but it's happening in a pretty small, limited capacity if you think about the whole sector. It's not like everyone's now like, oh, we just agreed that this is the way to do things. I think it still really pushes against the status quo of how things are done, which again is that very industrial model of like, no, from our towers, we write the policies, we can figure everything out there, then we can kind of pass it on to people and they'll be able to translate it outside, which is more, I think, more of a product logic kind of way of thinking about policy.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so reflections, going back over this, and that I'd love to kind of discuss more. I will say that homelessness has actually increased since 2019. That there's numerous factors, including there was a pandemic since then, inflation. There's been widening gap between rich and poor in Canadian society. Property prices have gone up. But homelessness has increased. And there has been like hundreds of millions of dollars spent on this problem to fix it. And it's actually getting worse. So a few things, and again, this is in my humble opinion, I will caveat by saying that the think tank model is broken. I think incentives need to change to focus on outcomes. And I think an interesting thing that a lot of service designers use in their processes is actually thinking about outcomes of a service or outcomes of phases of services. I think an orientation towards thinking about what are the outcomes that we hope to drive here would be really helpful. Perhaps looking at social impact bonds. I don't know if you're familiar with those. But we've worked on a project that used social impact bonds with a social service agency that was really effective at driving outcomes and improving health outcomes because they were on the hook to do so. Not that it's a perfect model, but I think it actually puts a bit more pressure. I think you need to build an accountability for those with budgets and replace publications as the primary currency. I think right now, people who hold the budgets are responsible for making publications, and that's not a meaningful way to drive outcomes. Second is adding skills and resources. So I think what's been effective in this work and the seeds that have been planted are leveraging an anti-oppressive framework that includes affected populations in ways that meaningfully empower them and that are building their skills and their participation in a process that's really being more led by them. I think that it's important that you also think about resources and not just skills, and that you explore how resources can also be reallocated directly to affected populations. it almost reminds me of how in corporate world, doing workshops with post-it notes and like ideation, and everyone gets excited, and the designers come in, and it's all kind of everyone gets pumped up, and then nothing happens, and that it actually undermines the work. It actually makes people more doubtful that designers can have a meaningful impact on things. I think that it's really important that that resources get associated with these movements, so that there's actually an investment made to make meaningful outcome. And the third thing that I'd put, and this is an idea that I've just been thinking about and we've been experimenting with, which is actually leaning more into the conflict and negotiating conflicts, using your prototypes, using the design process. And I'm using this term kind of proto-diplomats as the way of like how a diplomat would negotiate between parties. I think the desire in design processes to include lots of stakeholders and to ensure everyone's involved, everyone's happy, it leads to lots of talk, and it leads to lots of kind of decision by committee. And decision by committee is when you try to get everyone to make the decision, and it's not a good decision. I think focusing on very specific services, designing specific prototypes that actually increase the visibility of trade-offs and conflict. And I think designers aren't trained this way. They're not trained to think about conflict, and they're not trained to think about trade-offs. And every project has conflict, and conflict is a necessary precursor to change. And trade-offs are necessary to make change happen. For example, in the Welsh model, 60% of the people who worked in the homelessness sector left the sector in Wales. They were people who were used to, again, they were gatekeepers that were used to deciding who was worthy of having a job, or sorry, not different, like access to a home or resources or not. And as a result, a lot of people needed to change those roles. They needed new kinds of skills. They needed new kind of people. And again, the person who was leading that there was really focused on finding very specific things, making them happen, and driving. And it wasn't about doing the thing that was going to make everyone happy and be popular. So I think it's important, if we really want to drive towards these kinds of changes that are required within society, some of these meaningful things that we're grappling with, that we need to be better at kind of meaningfully grappling with trade-offs and embracing conflict as a necessary part of the design process, and actually embedding that into the prototyping that we do.
I'll just stop you there, because we have two questions in the chat that I think is just what we talked about. And the first is, could focus be shifted from experience to value or meaning? Would that have made a difference?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I'm just trying to think about sorry, say the question. The difference was between experience and value or meaning?
Could focus be shifted from experience to value or meaning? I think that it was posted when you talked about this, that you didn't reach out to in the project that good, and the focus on the experience within the user. Would that be more? Could it be more if you focused on the value or the value creation for the user? Would that have made some difference?
I think so. Definitely. I think that if you thought about, for the people experiencing this, what's valuable and meaningful to them, and from their point of view through these processes, are we actually driving towards that? I think that would be a good way of thinking about whether this is successful or not. Yes.
Perfect. And now we have another question that is related to that point about designers coming in, doing workshops, and then nothing happening. What do you think designers need to do better to materialize outcomes and generate impact, and make sure that the ideas become reality outside the workshops?
I really think that while you're prototyping, designers need to get better at understanding like, what are the trade-offs necessary for this to work? And actually, when they're prototyping, making those be much clearer, or even maybe leaning a little bit more into, with what they're designing, showing how those trade-offs come to life. So for example, we had people in this project who worked in homelessness shelters saying, but if we have less people, we get less money. And so their mental model, again, is very different around how this sector works. And if they don't understand, if that trade-off isn't clear when you're prototyping, that like what we're talking about is changing. It's about moving resources upstream so these people don't become homeless in the first place. And again, I don't think I stated this earlier, but there is evidence, there is reports, there is research to say that doing things this way saves money, better outcomes. Like, this is the way to do it. There's no debate that moving resources upstream is a much more efficient way to do things. What needs to happen is you need to actually show how things change, embrace those trade-offs, talk about those kinds of trade-offs and conflicts, and really give up that need to kind of have everyone be involved and be happy in the process. I think there's kind of an illusion around design and co-design that it's about everyone coming together and being happy and getting to like some shared thing that works for everyone. I don't think that's the case when you look at actually how things happen and change. And I don't think we're training our designers to think that way, to think that when you do a design project, there's going to be trade-offs. And that you need to make those clear. If you really want your design to be adopted, you need to make those clear and show people what they're signing up for, how it's actually going to change for them, for different people in this sector. And I think that's hard. I know for myself, because I'm kind of more of an idealistic and kind of like want to get along with people kind of person. And I think part of what draws me to design is that I like that it's feels like that, you know, it's like I can see the world as it could be. And like, I think a lot of the strength of people who are in design is that idealism and creativity, but I think it gets in the way of actually getting things done. I think we need to be thinking about trade-offs. We need to think about when you make, and we've been experimenting more with this, prototyping things and showing, if we do it this way, these people will be involved and this group will not. If we do it this way, more resources go to this group, and they now actually are more driving this outcome, and historically they weren't. I think that kind of ability to materialize some of those things as part of a design process. Again, when you think about really what happened in Wales, it wasn't about making everyone happy, making everything, you know, taking everyone who was there and just easily transitioning them, but they've really transformed the outcomes of how things work there in a really successful, meaningful way. So I think that's a really important component that I think is just like something we need to get better at. And it's kind of something to think about from training designers, from engaging in design projects. And it's something that, you know, happy to talk more about. That's everything. So thank you. Thank you all so much. Again, like I really hope that this was helpful just to think about, you know, again, some things that I think worked well, some things that didn't work well. Really happy to stick around and hear any suggestions that people have and other things that they're doing, and really appreciate you having me here, Calais and team, and yeah, thank you all so much.
Perfect. I think we open up for a discussion for those who have questions they haven't posted in the chat. So please feel free to just raise your hand or just get yourself into the discussion. I know there are a lot of people here like to ask some questions. I don't think I see you here. We have one in the chat, although it's Lisa Pitting. Can you tell us more about how you recruited and onboarded the youth for the journal study?
Yeah, so we were working with a partner that was I think it's called the Hamilton Indian Friendship Center. So it's a group that was already working really closely with youth. There was, because of the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness and Away Home, this project that was underway, they already had kind of relationships with people in the service sector and different agencies. So we worked really closely with people who are already working with those communities and kind of leveraged them. So we went to kind of existing community groups as a way of doing it.
And I see that Josina has her hand up, so please.
Hi, Josina.
Chris, nice to see you. I'm really struck by this tension that Fergus was getting at too around this materializing outcomes, especially in the space of homelessness. And I think in a lot of kind of places that design is moving into, I think of like the decolonial turn in design and these things, and that there's quite a strong critique that a lot of the work we do can end up in more discussion. And I think what you were saying about kind of staying close to the prototyping and the material change and somehow making visible this change in resources is really interesting. And it makes me wonder about how we can stay accountable to material changes in outcomes in our design and kind of like build that more specifically into our kind of ways of working and our own accountability. And yeah, I love what you were just kind of saying about how, you know, it shows one group getting something and another group not, and what it means to kind of sit with that. And just thinking about, do you think what skills or what things can we bring to that effort to fit with very real changes and their impacts on a system and kind of get comfortable with shifting power? Do you have any thoughts around that kind of material change and the tension of just like being with it as a designer?
Yeah, 100%. And completely agree with the sentiment and the critique. And that, you know, like I really personally feel that like an insight without impact is kind of useless. It's like if you have an insight about yourself, but you don't change, you just keep having the same thought over and over again, you know, it's like, what's really the purpose of it? And I feel like we're kind of in that business of just like generating the same insight over and over again, you know, and it's really not impactful. So how to approach it? And again, early experiments in trying this. One thing is in the process, what I've started to do and what we've started to do is purposefully stratifying your prototypes to show trade-offs. So, and so if you think about, you're going into a process and you're changing something within a system, you could say, okay, well, I recognize that this group and this group, you know, like there's potential trade-offs maybe in who has power and who has resources, where the main kind of elements, touch points of the service reside, which would have implications on resources. Actually pushing those out even more into the extreme when you're prototyping. And I think about it, do you know, like the old equalizers on stereos where you could like turn up and down I always think about it like in your prototypes, really changing them and pushing them to the extremes and saying, okay, well, in this case, how does it look if it's really driven by this set of stakeholders? And really the service tends to reside more here and emphasizes these kinds of elements. Okay, let's now do let's do another one and talk about this. And prototyping it and actually showing the world where that happens leads to a really meaningful conversation. You know, like we've done this around a kind of other projects we've done where there's different stakeholders involved in more of a kind of system where ownership will reside with a certain stakeholder. And depending on that, it has really meaningful implications. And for perhaps things like, if I make it more of a digital service, that means like this stakeholder is really going to end up being more in control. If we make it more of a in-person brick and mortar thing, it ends up these stakeholders are much more in control. And actually stratifying some of those elements to say, okay, now that we can see this, what does it tell us for the implications of what needs to be done? You know, like actually then having a meaningful conversation, an honest conversation about what would have to happen for that to be true. Rather than, you know, and it's funny, run, and I know, Josina, you've done, because I've run this kind of with, activity with your students as well, but some activities around trying to get designers to do this and thinking about stratifying concepts. And they tend to not want to do that. They don't want to make those kinds of trade-offs. They want to, everything ends up kind of going back to trying to make everyone happy. But I think that doesn't lead to actually showing how it would actually materialize, talking about the kinds of implications, and having honest conversations about really what needs to change.
Okay, we have two persons with their hands raised. First, Ferguson, then Karin.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much, Chris. This stuff is fantastic. I'm super interested in this happiness thing. And with it, the other side of that, the conflict that you talk about. I just sort of wondered, from your experience, or I know you've obviously been involved in teaching, what do you think the ground course would be for designers in getting comfortable with emotions, or the type of emotions that are likely to come up in these sorts of dialogues? And maybe it's not just designers, maybe it's bureaucrats, policymakers, public sector workers, society. I'm thinking of Callie, you did a fantastic email this month talking about conflict avoidance in Swedish public sector culture. So there are different norms in different societies, but I'm thinking also of the indigenous communities that you work with, and are there other ways of thinking about this? Or what sort of is the basics that you think we would all need to be able to navigate these conflicts more successfully and discuss these sorts of trade-offs?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I wish I had a good answer to it. But you know, there's the old expression, like, some people are bad at dealing with conflict and the rest are terrible. You know, like, I think that's like, it's a kind of thing, nobody wants to do it, you know. Like, I think that it's uncomfortable and it's awkward and it brings up things that people don't want to face, you know. But I think that the cool thing about what designers are really great at is being able to make things and show things. And I think that actually being able to make things material, I think that seeing them as kind of thought experiments and saying, like, let's just play this out. Let's just play this out, and let's think about not one road again, which I think is more of like kind of industrial model. Like, let's think about many roads with different implications, and let's have a conversation about what those kinds of trade-offs would be. So I think it can be held in a kind of neutral space. I think that the interesting thing again about design is the ability to kind of show a world that doesn't yet exist. And in doing that, just as when we did, we unearthed all these other more social and structural issues that came up. I think by playing out those scenarios, you really bring to life those social and structural issues. And I think that, you know, work like looking at like the work Josina's done, and kind of some of the work thinking about using design to facilitate a conversation about some of those underlying issues. I think by thinking about the relationship between the material and the social in the design process, and thinking about part of my job when I'm prototyping things isn't just to make the new interface of the app, it's actually to show how the structure and how the relationships change when I do that. I think that needs to be part of how we think about design process when we're doing design in these kinds of contexts.
Can I come back very quickly on that? Because I've been thinking about this, and I, as someone who is an industrial designer myself, I'm all into the materialization, and I'm absolutely with you in everything you say. But I'm wondering if that almost limits us. That really what we should be also thinking about is how those material things affect us. So it's the sort of a reaction that they give, and that if we as designers were not so preoccupied with the facilitation and the social, or the making and the material, although both of those components are necessary and we have to be good at them, but actually how does that make us all feel to interact, good or bad? That if that was sort of how we saw our practice, I guess this goes back to these sorts of more classical ideas of people being moved, sort of romantic ideas, I guess, as well. And we maybe need to be careful. But I'm just playing these things out. And I suppose that's my reaction to what you're saying, is that maybe we're almost limiting ourselves by the focus on the material, because it's actually how does the material or the social move people or affect people as a result. But I'll leave that there, and hopefully other people can ask a question. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, I think it's both. I think your instincts are right. I think it's both, and I think it's, you know, it's funny. There's actually well, I'll say two things. One, growing up, you know, my mom was in HR and human resources, like a leader in human resources. So like that whole idea, like culture eats strategy for lunch, and it's all about people. Like I really think that. And then my dad's side of the family were all like tradespeople, and they were making things. And so I saw this thing and this kind of practicality around making things and making things real, you know, and the kind of, and I think that I think that you need to think about the relationship with both. And there's actually an interesting scholar, Matt Ratto, I don't know if you've seen his work, he talks about critical making. And if you look up critical making, like there's really interesting things where he actually has a lab where they make things, but the purpose is to actually think more critically through the process of making. And that thing of like, you push something into the world pushes back, you know? So I do think it's about both the material and the social, and the relationship between the two. And that's where things get interesting. And I mean, I've even in private sector work had things where, you know, I worked on a project where it was around a kind of customer interaction where historically sales representatives had kind of hidden some information, or it wasn't always consistent how they dealt with different customers. And that really bothered customers, you know, as you can imagine. Some people got better deals than other people. And we were redesigning some of the elements of this experience. And we knew that, you know, we could change the digital interface. We could change some of the interaction of how the rep talked to the person in store and in the call center. But if you didn't change some underlying things around how they saw their role, their beliefs around how things worked, then it wasn't going to work, you know, and that you needed to kind of have, so we actually talked about 3 different scenarios, one that's very transparent, one that stays the same, and something in between. And we said, let's talk about the implications on things like your transparency and trust scores, on how your perception of things change. I think that we could, by prototyping and talking about the material and then talking about some of the underlying social, we were able to have a really good conversation about trade-offs and consequences.
I think we have Karin as the last reflection or maybe question. Please, Karin.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for this presentation. It's so nice to hear, and a wonderful project. Super happy that you're doing like pro bono work. I was thinking about this anti-oppressive framework that you had as like underlying, and how did you know that you had to do that? And how did you go about like doing that? How did you work with that framework, and how did you know how to bring that framework as like a baseline of this work?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think we knew because of the sensitivity of the populations that we were dealing with, and some of the systemic issues related to people in those populations, that there was historical and cultural reasons why those people were overly represented in having lower social determinants of health, including homelessness. So I think there was some acknowledgement that there are systemic things happening that are actually leading to these populations being affected. The thing we did is we brought in training, and then thought about and reflected on ways in which that could impact the way we conducted our work. So things like the way the research was conducted changed as a result of thinking about how to interact with these populations. I think that even some of the conclusions and the ways we were able to the questions we were able to ask and think about when we were interacting with different kind of system actors, I think changed as a result of being more aware of some of the systemic issues that were involved. So really it was kind of training and then thinking about how would it materially change our practice of what we're going to do in this project, and then changing the process as a result. And it's interesting. Just I think to that point and what Josina you were saying earlier, I just think you see this time and time again where often there's kind of lip service and people will say these things, but you don't really see material change as a result of it. And I had a conversation last week with a First Nations leader who's at an MBA program at the University of Victoria, setting up an MBA in reconciliation, which is this process that we're going through in Canada of kind of reconciling with the past of kind of a genocide and, just systemic issues around the treatment of First Nations. And he said, as a result of this TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, he was able to get a job at the university, but he said everything else, how tenure works, how he's evaluated, the way the university runs, nothing had changed. So he's like, he gave the metaphor of you have a table and you're inviting people to the table, but the thing inside the table is not changing. And then he said, he'd been there for 3 years. They didn't have a single First Nation student in the program after 3 years. So there was a thing around, I think there's a difference between, are we materially changing something like a university to actually deal with something like reconciliation? Are we happy to keep things the same, but just have conversations around the perimeter, or change the ways we talk, or what goes into how we talk about things? I think that's different than actually changing how things work, and I think that requires a different kind of look and a different kind of examination of trade-offs and change. And that's, I think, the place where we are right now as a society, is really needing to take a hard look at a lot of those things and saying, where do we need to change?
Perfect. Thank you very much, Chris, for a fantastic presentation. And thank you very much, all of you, for all these great discussions and great reflections and questions.